Welcome everyone to the final webinar in the Queensland AI Hub Medical Datathon webinar series. Thanks for joining us again. We have another couple of excellent speakers, so I'm really excited to hear them both talk today. So as usual, we'll have one speaker and then a question session afterwards, and you can post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A and we'll try and get your questions answered. We'll have the second question round after the second speaker. So without further ado, let me introduce Ides Wong. So Dr. Ides Wong is from Queensland Health. She's a Principal Policy Officer at the Mental Health, Alcohol and Other Drugs branch in Queensland Health. Her portfolio includes supporting the development of joint regional mental health and suicide prevention planning. So today, Dr. Ides Wong is going to talk to us about never let a good crisis go to waste, harnessing the chaos of COVID-19 to advance the data agenda. So take it away, Ides. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. I should say before I share screen, can you hear me? Yeah?
Can hear you all good.
Great, excellent, thank you. So apologies, I think that might have been extracted from my old profile. So that was my old job a few years back. So I'm now the Queensland Health Data Strategy Lead out of COVID. So through COVID, it's that it was clear through the data ecosystem, someone needs to grow across kind of different data teams and stitch the data strategy together. So my talk is really about never let a crisis go to waste, harnessing the chaos of COVID-19 to advance the data analytics agenda out of Queensland Health. I think in the COVID environment and pandemic response in Queensland nationally and internationally as well, it's a crisis environment where day-to-day the situation change. We probably see a lot of media reports about today the topic is PPE. Do we have enough PPE? Tomorrow it could be something different altogether. You know, do we have enough swabs? Do we have enough something else? Or do we have enough toilet paper, for instance? We've also kind of looked at that. So through the COVID, one thing I've learned is that if you don't know which direction that you're going, you never catch on. No wind is favorable. Every day is a bad day. And that is an ethos that sits behind a lot of our data analytics work. We have a very clear vision about where we're going in terms of our data agenda. What are the priority pieces that we will have to establish beyond COVID throughout this pandemic period and beyond? And which ones that we have to absolutely do in a crisis environment, and we have to be very clear about those. So I think a lot of you probably have seen those curves and heard about this being about flatten the curve. It has entered our everyday language about flattening the curve. And in Australia, particularly in Queensland, we have done tremendously well in obliterating the curve. We haven't had an active cases for a while, or just one case every few days or so. The way we use the data intelligence is not just identifying and isolating test cases, but it's also anticipating the need in order to lift our health service, both in terms of what kind of health service would we need for early uplift, where do they need to be, what do we need to do in preparation for that to happen, so that we can really reach our health service capacity, anticipating the pandemic need. So what exactly is our data agenda through COVID? Early on, it was a lot of descriptive piece, and I think you've all seen a lot of these kind of descriptive graphs about demographics, you know, age groups and where they're from, sort of thing. So those are very descriptive kind of data visualization telling us about case characteristics, so we can get a better understanding of the virus. Then we move to more diagnostic, identifying target areas, hotspots, understanding target groups of interest, you know, where do we need to focus our testing efforts, and in terms of our communications, for instance, and also, you know, quarantine efforts, where do we need to go? But we really want to push beyond that and go to that predictive and prescriptive side. And I'll spend a little bit of my time to talk a little bit more about, you know, the predictive and prescriptive side. Is about Can we predict transmission based on mobility? And if we could we do that at a more regional level? How fine-grained can we do that? Could we install some early warning system and do some early uplift of health services that we've talked about earlier? And what are the kind of system and clinical improvement that we can drive out of that? You know, what exactly is the patient journey? Now, I think in Queensland, as with a lot of other different countries, is that this is a very rapid response environment. We had to stand up, you know, services in response to that need. But we need to be very clear about when patient comes into the system, a COVID patient or non-COVID patient, how do they traverse through our system to make sure that their data analytics can be stitched up, so we have a very integrated view of the care. So what is it like in a typical COVID day? I think I have a lot of some people from the AI Datathon actually asked me that in the private channels, and also I've had a lot of friends and family go, what is it like, you know, working during COVID times? I think it's a lot of, you know, this is the visual that I like to present to people, is that you see a lot of disaster movies and pandemic movies, and you would see a control room. And our control room in our SHEC and our State Health Emergency Centre, it doesn't look too different to this. You know, you've got screens, you've got people working behind, you've got comms, you've got data and all that sort of stuff. But every now and then there are systemic shocks and, you know, announcement, for instance, that introduce chaos. So when you walk into the control room, it's just going to be people running everywhere. And then that takes time for that to settle down, to distill, and then we go back in the cycle. So I don't know if any of you remember, I think I was watching back then, I think Sunday evening or Sunday afternoon is usually the time where the Prime Minister likes to do the press conference and do announcement. And I distinctively remember one Sunday afternoon, I think, when he announced that the international borders will close and everyone who comes through will go into quarantine. And that moment that I realized, oh, things is really going to change. And in fact, the next morning when I go in, you could just see that people have been there through the night working away. So those are the kind of, you know, changes we have. So in a typical COVID data day, what does it mean? So a common data problem we have is that, you know, someone will ask seemingly a simple question of how many people have been screened across Queensland over the last 24 hours. Seems like a relatively simple question. You locate, so as a data strategy lead or the data brokerage person, someone asks you this question and you go, okay, I think this is the team that can provide me this answer. You go to this person or team that you think has the number, and if you have any luck and if you're really good at your job, this person will tell you a good number that you go 1,500. That sounds very sensible. But then you kind of go, well, you know, just for reporting safety, you always confirm your numbers. You repeat step one, you find someone else to corroborate the answer. And sometimes you would hear something quite different. You know, you kind of go 850. So you go 850 and 1,500. Oh, there's some discrepancy, but this is a range that I can work with. You know, there could be some data cleaning purposes, you know, the data validation thing. We can work with that range and iron out the problems. But because you're getting slightly different versions, you just want to be sure that these are the only two versions out there to really confirm that this is the range that you're working with. And this is really important during a COVID response. So you do that again, you know, you ask someone else and you make sure. And then this person could come in at 4,500. At that point, you realize that you've unearthed something very interesting that you potentially have to report in the next hour, and you are in a bit of a prickly situation. Then you try to stand there, maintain composure, and be brave and ask the dumb question. And I think this is a big learning lesson in terms of working in COVID data, is that don't assume people understand what exactly you're asking them, or what exactly is being asked of them here. So ask the really dumb question about, do we all agree on what screening means? I'm being a new person. I'm not, a technical lead in any of these data teams. So I need to understand, what exactly are we talking about? What do you mean by screening? And what do you mean by screening? So in this particular instance, you realize that from a police or border force perspective, screening means everyone off the flight. They screen the ones who have been to China, or, depending on when the pandemic response, it could be Iran, Italy, etc. And then direct those to the public health officers, the public health teams. That's what it's meant by screening. Okay, well, does the public health people agree with that? Public health could come back and say that, well, screening to them actually means everyone who has been directed to me by Border Force, I screen them for travel history and symptoms, and only those that meet the criteria for quarantine or screening, whatever means. So it's a subset of what Border Force would be saying. So straight away, you're getting two different definitions here. And then in Queensland, we have got 3 different international airports. So we could have one airport, one public health officers out of one airport reporting one set of definition, and then the other reporting another set of definition. So straight away, you are getting this kind of mishmash of data set that is actually different things. Combine that with perhaps, not an automated data management, because we have to remember, during the crisis response, everyone had to be mobilized to do things very quickly. In a crisis environment, we all take comfort in doing what we know. We pivot to what we understand and what we've been using daily. So you could have spreadsheets different out of different airport. Some of them will be free text. Some of them will have a really standard format to start out with. But as you have more and more people working, and there's no established data processes in place, the format's changing really quickly. And it could be also in response to a new announcement that the Prime Minister has made. The format had to be changed to report it, or we are asking people to be reporting things differently on different days because of media questions, etc., etc. So not only will we be working with different data definitions, we'll be working with different formats, different fields, different reporting, and try to wrangle that can be very tricky. So that was a typical COVID day, was wrangling some data processes like that. Doing this in a frenetic pace like COVID with different teams, half of them could be really present, half of them may also be dealing with very urgent stuff that they really have to get onto. So it's my analogy is, you get different pairs of hands pulling apart this kind of tangled string together. So that a lot of that, it comes down to people making sure the team that's in the room are the right fit to entangle these balls of string, making sure that when they are in the room, they understand what is being asked of them and what they can do, and being able to and feel confident to articulate that back to you. And, in a crisis environment, we don't have time to waste. So if this is a ball of string that perhaps we can't untangle it, we can only untangle it halfway, we need to pivot into doing something different. We have to enable people to be able to say those things and have that courage to do that. So that's a very typical COVID day. Now, doing that, it's challenging and it's exciting, but we can't go solving every data problem every day. And that's because resources are stretched, and also we have very limited time. So we need to really focus on what we could do in here. So I've got this matrix that I think everyone would have seen some variation of. What is urgent? What is not urgent? Crisis environment, you have to do the urgent stuff. The urgent and important stuff, there is no going about it. You just have to do it. The urgent and not important stuff, it's about delegating. And sometimes in that environment, there is no one to delegate to, or by the time you locate the person you could delegate to, potentially it is faster to, do it yourself or do it with someone else. Go for second best. They will have to do that. The not urgent, not important, that's easy. You can sidestep and kind of articulate the reasons and then move on. Now, the not urgent, but actually really important stuff, we need to be very clear about that. Because there are important data agenda pieces that, without the right situation and opportunity, it could just be a futuristic pipe dream, or it will take us 5 years to get there. But presenting with the right environment and the right fix and the right push, you can actually edge it a lot further. So that is the clearest thing that we need to be, we need to understand. So how do we do that? Well, I like to say different contexts, similar process. Understand what are those pieces, what are the important things on our data agenda that we would like to get to, having that roadmap, even in some kind of amorphous way, being able to differentiate the descriptive stuff from the prescriptive stuff. Spot the window of opportunity. So that takes a lot of networking, making sure you're always you have a seat at the table. You always make yourself available. You always kind of articulate that you are someone that can support people's data problems. So they can see the value that you provide to them, and they see you as someone who can assist them. And they will present you with those windows of opportunity when one arises. Identify and articulate the problem. It's everyone's data and everyone's problem. And I think that's really, really clear from the pandemic and through our work, is that, this is not your data, this is not your data, this is not my data, it's everyone's data. And being able to articulate how does bad data impact on their work, and more importantly, in our system collective response to COVID. What is the value in solving this problem? Sometimes when people are knee deep in mud, they can't quite see, out of that. So being able to articulate that, what exactly are the solutions? It's one thing to spot a problem. If you don't have some way of getting them out of it, you need to articulate the solutions. Even if you don't get them 100% there, you need to be able to articulate approximately this is how we're going to go and what exactly is feasible. Getting everyone to agree on the solution. It may not be perfect, but everyone has to be on board to work on that. And I think it's very important in data, don't make the cure worse than the problem. We don't want to articulate a solution that's going to take us ages to work on. Perfection can be the enemy of the good here. We can at least push us halfway, and that would be really good. And then most importantly is to ensure the work that we are doing adds value and can be set up for perpetuity. And I do want to go back to the quote that I presented earlier, is that being very clear in your mind and try to distill that to the different teams, what exactly we are trying to head to. That is not just important to pick important work pieces to focus on, that is actually also really important for team morale as well. When you are getting people to work 15-hour days, 18-hour days, coming in on weekends, day in, day out, they can feel very drained. I felt very drained that day in, day out. I am just what I call working on data dumpster fires. But if you're clear about the future that you're working towards and how different pieces actually push you further along, you will be able to, push yourself a lot further. So I want to spend a little bit of time about what exactly are we trying to get towards. I think I talked about the differences between descriptive and prescriptive. What we're trying to set up is that, three arms of improving clinical intelligence, business intelligence, including public health intelligence, and research, and how that could benefit research. So having that, clinician and patient consent, so that we can, through a aggregated data, and apply sophisticated analysis, generating information and knowledge that would benefit all three pillars of our core work. And, once we've got that kind of system level thinking in terms of data and analytics, we can look at, machine learning to improve our clinical intelligence, applying to different, genomics and omics and diagnostics and consent, to facilitate the research environment. And ultimately, all that, and I, we always have to be very clear that all of these cool data analytic works goes back to the clinician and patient benefit. It's about improved clinical care, a more efficient system, a more connected system, and that ultimately benefits patient outcomes. One of the problems that we presented to the Datathon is the COVID Barometer. So I just want to showcase a little bit about what that was about. Some of you might have seen that as a problem that came up. So it's about establishing a health insurance for reopening society. So the fundamental question is, could we predict transmission based on mobility? We all have talks about social distancing measure, people are traveling in the shops, and does people going out to the shops in the rally, is that an indicator for transmission? If we can map that, what does that mean? Could we have early warning signals for where transmission may happen? Could we actually have more regional understanding of where transmission could happen and do early uplift of services that's more focused and more dynamic? And what are the overlap between effective containment measures and economically valuable activities? So we don't want to close society down completely. Maybe there are certain activities that are low risk in terms of transmission, but high reward in terms of social and economic health that we could focus on reopening. So this is kind of what we've looked at, is looking at overlaying mobility data compared to last year as a proxy for activity levels, and how does that impact on epi transmission, so COVID transmission. And most importantly, it goes back to hospital surveillance, is that we can open up society more if we stay underneath the hospital capacity line. So we can develop a dynamic tracking module to look at different health regions. How are they tracking? Are they green or are they orange? Could we open up, if they're tracking well, maybe we can open up a little bit more. But if they're not tracking so well, we need to look at how to dial activity down, but to a way that still maintains social and economic health. And these are some of the different data sets that we are looking into ingesting into our platform as well. So I want to pay specific attention to mental health, alcohol, and other drugs, and say that now that with the progressive easing of restrictions, what we are aware is that the potential cost in some of the containment measures in sort of alcohol and other drug use, mental health issues and suicide ideation and so on. And we're keen to map that, because be able to quantify some of that social containment measures to understand the broader impact COVID has had and potentially will have on the society as well. So that's my talk, and I would like to open up questions, if that's okay.
Thanks so much, Ides. That was really interesting. And I think that I love that you've connected all sort of different elements together. So also the economic and psychological impact of a pandemic such as COVID, and then also looking at the interconnectivity of the different data types that we can look at and how we can use those to address the pandemic, which I think is also an idea or a concept that can be expanded to beyond just COVID. And especially keeping in mind that COVID is sort of At least in Australia, we seem to have it under control to an extent, and people are now refocusing on their sort of perhaps original fields or topics. I'll start with the first question, I guess. What benefits outside of just the COVID pandemic do you see tools such as the COVID Barometer and integrating data, increasing data connectivity, do you see for society outside of the pandemic?
There is an excellent question. We actually just got off a meeting with the Mental Health Commission about that. We think that with COVID, particularly in Australia, it's going to be a longer term response. So there's something like the COVID Barometer, where we overlay different data to understand at a holistic societal level the impact dynamically. It's going to help progressive easing of restrictions. Beyond that, it provides us a platform to track at a population level what are some of the seismic shock and what are some of the impact of this shock. So for example, if we have an attack, if we have, when the job seeker payments may end, what are some of the impacts on our health and well-being levels, on our activity levels? So that's going to be something. The other thing I want to mention is that COVID Barometer is a platform, is a data analytic platform. But what we really want is to advance the data agenda is to provide a platform for us to think about the different data and overlay. We always talk about social determinants of health. So this provides a foundation to which different areas can come together to look at how their work potentially get impacted by other people's work, and so on and so forth, and share data and facilitate those sort of roundtable discussions.
Fantastic. And we do have one comment, not so much a question, but I will read it and then ask you a question following that. Sure. So Christine Jackman says, data collection during COVID has been challenging in a clinical setting given the unknown nature of the disease. Clinicians are still working out what markers, etc., to look for and what data is particularly valuable to collect. So just wondering if you could speak to how interconnectivity might address an issue such as that for clinicians.
Yeah, that is a really great question. So one of the P's that we are working on is also that long-term patient journey. So using COVID as a triggering event, how do we stitch the different data sets and data platform together? So let's say, Steph, you have been unfortunately diagnosed with COVID. Once you enter the system, when did you see a GP? When did you go to the hospital? What happened there? Or, you did a test. What's the result? And all those sorts of stuff, and follow a long-term trajectory. So that kind of platform will provide us more fine-tuned understanding of the markers and how did you find throughout that process. And it becomes a self-learning kind of mechanism to identify, Steph and other people like Steph, what are some of the kind of indicators for early intervention as well. So if over the longer term, there are some impacts, health impacts on COVID, for example, to your kidney, then we can find you and say, hey, would you like to come in and do some more further testing? So that's the kind of thing.
Excellent. Yeah, really good answer. And that absolutely makes sense. So yeah, fantastic. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. It's a topic I think we could all talk about for a long time. But I think some really great points in that even if the acute, threats of the pandemic are slowing down, there are still a lot of follow-on effects that will need to be followed up and traced, and the work you're doing will be really vital to doing that. So thank you very much. And
thanks, Steph. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya, Ides.
See ya.
Okay, so now I will introduce our next speaker. So we are very fortunate to have Russell joining us. So Russell Duncan is from Telstra Health. Russell is the Chief Technology Officer for Telstra Health. In his role, he's accountable for three things: supporting the technology elements of any large new sales, providing technical strategy guidance and responsibility for the centralised technology teams. So prior to joining Telstra Health, Russell owned the company formerly known as Emerging Systems, which Telstra Health purchased in 2015, and prior to that was the CIO at Sydney Adventist Hospital. Russell is a thought leader and advocate for better technology for the health sector in Australia. He's passionate about making a real significant difference to the health of individuals, Russell's mantra is, technology is the servant of the user, not the other way around. Russell has degrees in education, information, technology, and science. So looking forward to hearing you speak. Go ahead, Russell.
Thanks very much, Steph. I appreciate the time. Briefly today, I'd like to cover off on the current Telstra Health perspective on artificial intelligence, and for us as vendors, a little bit about what our journey has been and what we've learned so far. So the content that I will address today, if I can make my PowerPoint work, oops, sorry, is who briefly is Telstra Health. So there's a shared understanding, the issues that we've found associated with data quality, garbage in, garbage out, some industrial strength frameworks, and we'll explain a little bit about what that means. But as vendors, we're quite concerned that our products actually work when we implement them, the change in adoption issues that we face, and of course, industry support for AI more broadly. Just briefly, Telstra Health is a number of market segments across mostly the Australian and New Zealand market space, but fairly significantly in data and analytics in the UK and in Europe. We have Population Health Solutions, which runs, amongst other things, the National Cancer Screening Register for bowel and cervical cancer. We have a Hospitals and Connected Health group, and most of the applications, the EMR implementations, for example, are in private hospitals, but there are some products in the vertical space quite strongly across health, and Queensland is one of those with our patient flow products. Primary and community health, especially in Aboriginal medical clinics. There's a big footprint across those. We cover like 80% of Aboriginal medical centres across Australia. We run a number of virtual care solutions, and this one's a combination of the remote monitoring stuff that you'd expect to see in the usual home environment. And in addition, of course, we have a telehealth facility as well. Aged and disability, we probably have about 60% of the beds under management for our clinical products. So we capture a lot of clinical data through those. And in the community space, we've got 200 or 300 clients in the community space, so most of the major providers. And of course, in our joint venture with Fred for the dispensing product, we run not only a number of corner store pharmacies with our product, but also run the ERX, that's our product, and of course, consequently, SafeScript. So that's the sort of remit of Telstra Health. You'll notice we've built our circle in terms of product because we're a product and solution focused company around technology, innovation, and analytics. And there has been a considerable amount of effort in the analytics and innovation space to get us onto the AI roadmap over the last couple of years. So as you undoubtedly have seen, a number of the major vendors in the US and in Europe have been adopting AI to help guide and implement their solutions for their clinicians and administrative staff. And part of the problem that we have is just making sure that we're doing it. There's been a lot of learnings in the industry, and I'm sure you've read the cases where there's been numerous implementations and then they've been stopped because they haven't worked for one or another reason. We've spent some time in the US, the UK, and Israel looking at their AI adoption and what works and what doesn't. And we've formulated a strategy, which is early days, but it's got active engagement over the last sort of 12 months. And turning that into what we believe will facilitate activities for our clients. First of all, it was good to hear Ides talk about data quality. And one of the things that we've really struggled with is most of our systems at the moment are transactional systems. And what we mean by that is they're used at the bedside or on the nurse's station or at the desk when you're doing dispensing for a pharmacist for a product. So most of the healthcare solutions that are around out there, other than the large implementations of EMR, for example, still capture a lot of data on paper. And so if you go into any one of our organisations, there's an amazing amount of data on paper. That proves to be a little complicated, and everyone says, yay, it's a real opportunity to use things like natural language processing, which we do actively engage with. But in terms of moving us to more reliable data, it's much easier for us to capture electronic text for individual data elements. And of course, as implementations have gone along, they've moved from paper through to free text. And subsequently, in terms of perfecting the data, there's individual data elements have been captured. So a lot of our clients, where they have gone from free notes before, are introducing forms where the data can be structured to remind clinicians about their data capture, but it's not always possible and not always timely. There are some smaller areas, let me call it that. I mean, to be fair, the volumes are very large, but there are some small areas in our spaces where the data is highly validated with individual data components. And the classics, of course, pathology results and medical images. And there's been a great deal of work on the AI space in both of those. Part of our problem was, or has been, that the original intent behind the capture of the data, and what we've meant by this is when the clinical staff or administrative staff were capturing the data, did they share the meaning for what it's going to be used eventually? And I think this has had a strong overlap with what I was talking about. Unfortunately, our systems have been around for quite some time, although they've matured dramatically in the last few years. There's data that goes back in excess of 30 years in our system, and what was captured 30 years ago will have a different meaning today. So in our adoption of AI, we're particularly concerned about the meaning of the data and what the content has been and what it will look like in the future. The other issue that we face is that the data validations for specific data elements weren't quite what they are now. And as organisations have matured and mandated certain elements in data capture, the data meaning shifts slightly. So some basic things like, capturing pulse rate without blood pressure, and depending on the context that we're in, whether it was in a measurement of a sports scientist or in a maternity case, are quite dramatically different data elements. And so these will be the things that all of the AI experts on the phone, on the meeting request, I'm sure, will be well and truly aware of. We've struggled with how to actually industrialise that, if you like, in our space, and move our systems from transactional systems to helping clinicians and all our user base provide sensible, typically, decision support. One of the other issues that's perplexed us, and we're not quite sure how this is going to pan out in the industry more broadly, but we've adopted an approach that we think will work. It's great to see so many development of, I'm going to hesitate to call them algorithms, but let's call them AI algorithms, and indeed even analytics algorithms. And I know a great deal of work has gone into looking at data to formulate those, because in the end, it's those that add value to the AI space. One of the big issues that we have is that with such a range of products, and there are about, 15 products across the Telstra Health market space, is how do we actually adopt those various types of AI technology? So, there's a lot of really great AI platforms out there that the algorithms are developed in. And part of the problem is that we face is if there's a Google one out there and a Microsoft one out there and a number of third-party open source ones, all of which are excellent. But for us, it's difficult to implement so many different kinds of infrastructure into our products. Not so much from the actual development of the original algorithms, we understand that's a separate process, but actually making it work in reality within our products. So this has slowed adoption into our products, at least into commercial ones. And we have struggled with that because our clients are quite keen to adopt, and for all of the right reasons. So how are we doing it? We've developed chosen a particular piece of standardized infrastructure, if you like, that we can port all the various algorithms across into. That's one way. A number of them we've found don't necessarily work, and it's kind of obvious why, because there's such a variation out there of tooling. But what we have is, we call it our API gateway. It's a piece of technology which we develop core microservices that sit behind our gateway. Now, it's not our preferred approach, but what it means is we can implement a standard way of talking to all our applications and have the AI technology sit behind it. Now, this is both inbound and outbound. So where it's used for things like decision support, we can actually put real data in and get advice back from what the tools are telling us. We are choosing not to implement individual AI pieces of technology within our code individually, but rather have a degree of separation, because as the technologies move on, we want to make sure that we can offer our clients a reasonably consistent user experience. And I know it sounds a bit strange, but there are a lot of really important non-functional aspects, and it's a big deal for us in terms of things like security and performance. So we've done some implementations of natural language processing, for example, in a trial basis on some of our large data sets. For example, in the National Cancer Screening Register, I think there's about 22 million participants, and I think in cervical alone, going back over 25 years, there's in the order of 200 million screening tests. Bowel is slightly larger in terms of the number of FOBT tests, and obviously considerably smaller in terms of the number of histology tests. But performance in processing the hundreds of thousands of transactions that we get every few days is a really significant component in making it the solution, adopting the right piece of AI solution. The other issue that's important for us is the security, and everyone wants to make sure that their data is secure, obviously. As the new technologies come along, this is not just about the usual penetration tests that vendors run. And it's not just about the usual privacy validations, but it's a combination of things that we are beginning to look at a much more complex matrix. And so our perspective on security is evolving, I have to say, is probably the best way to describe it. Yes, we do all the regular checks. Starting to look at the meaning behind what we're producing is also key to our security elements going forward as well. And a lot of the tools in security are only just now beginning to catch up, but it's very much work in progress. We've found with all good software implementations and with all good changes in business practices, that change in adoption is the key for us. So the products are great, the algorithms are terrific, but actually making them work at the coalface can be quite tricky. And so our client base, thankfully, are typically very risk averse and skeptical that what we provide them with is actually a valid solution. And at the same time, they're also actively engaged in leading us down the next, what's the next piece of technology that will benefit their, their clinical output or their business as a whole. And so we locally validate, and I use the term advisedly, the algorithms, helping for clinicians to be able to prove what we're saying is consistent. And what we have found is, even within our own clinicians from our own environments, where we have an AI algorithm, and it often does better than humans at doing things, for example, with codification of histology results, there's a real stretch for them to believe, and often for all the right reasons, even running it for 6 months and comparing them all manually, for example, isn't quite sufficient. So it's about the ability to actually explain what's going on. So the tooling that's associated with explainability is a big deal for us. Where we've run trials in the histocoding, for example, with natural language processing, converting it into SNOMED CTAU codes, we've found that we can do it at scale, which is terrific. We've struggled with all of the usual things that I'm sure your teams have struggled with in terms of great variations between individual pathology labs for their content, change from histopathologists to histopathologists, localized meanings of the English language, all of the usual things that you'd expect. But that doesn't mean that our validation needs to be any more or any less, and it's actually more important for us to get it right. So how are we implementing the AI technologies with our teams? Part of it's, we've got two sort of focuses. One is as part of the care delivery model in the clinical space. I shouldn't limit it to the care delivery model, to be fair. I should also include the administrative model, because there's a number of algorithms that we've implemented in the administrative space. But it's primarily around decision support, so that it's offering, let me call it, advice as to what should be done. The other model, which has often had a great deal of easier acceptance, is a QA model. So where decisions have been made by clinicians, simply validating that not too far away removed from the process in terms of time. Typically within hours, but also, as a bit of a reminder to go back and say, the system thinks this might be the case. Do you just want to go and validate that? And that's been really helpful in terms of the adoption with clinicians, because it's much less challenging. But at the same time, it acts as a safety net. And one of the approaches that we have done, which we find works really well, we've got a product in the UK that supports about 60% of the NHS data in terms of its analytics and interpretation. And we've found that AI and its adoption works really well over the very large data sets that they have. And so one of our key implementation strategies with AI is across and extending our analytics tooling. One of the things that we would like to address today is industry support. So the interaction between where the algorithms and all the smart work, we call it, is actually done. I mean, Telstra Health has a few data scientists. We've got only a small number of teams with experience in AI. And we've decided fairly firmly to make sure that we rely on the communities that exist out there in terms of how AI is developed and established. So many of this is with direct investments in AI solutions. So that's either partnering with a company, with small startups, fostering them, and the mergers and acquisitions where it makes commercial sense. A great deal of effort's going for us into graduate programs, which is a much longer term approach, unfortunately, but a sensible one to contribute back to industry. And of course, access to the data sets with the appropriate the ethics approvals, of course, but for our often with our clients to help facilitate that is a key issue. And of course, one of the things that we have had some direct experience in and will help more broadly, and I know it's not necessarily interesting, and I know it's not in today's use case around medical direct support, but it's in the, we've called it the less interesting things. Now, it's great to get AIs that help us in the diagnosis pathway for things like mammography. But there are a number of less exciting things out there that are typically related to activities that drive our clients' outcomes. So this may just be something as simple as throughput in theatres, for example, and how we can improve that. Many of those activities are administrative and don't directly engage with patients and consumers. But we have found that the interest of our clients is often to get the technologies involved in their space. There's less reticence to invest in components that require, let's call it activity-based efforts rather than clinical-based efforts. And it's a slow road in terms of our implementations. But I guess the key thing for us is we're very much on a journey. You'll see a number of announcements from Telstra Health over the next few months associated with AI and analytics. There's been a lot of work done already, but there's an awful lot more to go and a lot more opportunities for partnerships across the board. My contact details are here, but I'll hand back to Steph. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Russell. Really interesting to hear how Telstra is engaging in using AI and all the different areas that's being done. That's fantastic. I'm curious to know, because you mentioned at the end, some of the less interesting things that you're applying these technologies to are very important, and how they can, really improve a system. So I'd love to hear an example where, the use of a new AI tool from Telstra system has improved an area in healthcare, if you have one.
Yeah, so look, I guess the one that springs to mind, and developed by a third party, to be fair, but looking at the data sets that it supports and how we've run it over things is the classic and theatre utilisation. The theatres are the engine room of most acute hospitals. They do large numbers of transactions within the right safety limits, not pushing them to the extremes, but just optimizing how those are scheduled is a significant benefit to our customers. And one of the things I should mention, we are called Telstra Health for a reason. And part of the drive behind that is, our parent company in the telco space has had a great deal of experience in AI. And you saw some of the cell location tracking that Ides mentioned before, right? I mean, those data sets are held within, so for 50% of the population who have a mobile phone, are held within Telstra. So we've leveraged off a great deal of their experience in doing this as well. And there are, as we've gone along, we found that there are some strange healthcare nuances, and some of those we covered off in things like the meaning of the data when it was originally captured. So capturing a cell that a particular mobile phone was at is relatively easy, and the meaning is relatively static. I wish that were true in the clinical space.
Yeah, that's it. And it's great linking that to what Ida's talked about in how different data sets can be related to healthcare outcomes in ways you might not expect. So that's fantastic. Now, the floor is open to anyone in the audience to ask any questions if you'd like. Seems we don't have any coming in. You've covered all the topics so well, I guess. So Russell did kindly put his contact details up as well. That's a response from Ides. Beautiful. All right. Well, looks like no questions for now. Thanks a lot, Duncan. That was excellent talk, and Ides is still here, so thanks as well, Ides. This was our final webinar, but hopefully everyone gained as much value as I did from hearing all our excellent speakers. Again, if you wanted to ask any questions of them down the track, just get in touch with us and we can try and get those answered for you. Otherwise, we look forward to hopefully seeing most of you at the Datathon on Saturday. So starting at 11 again, and then we will have our pitch day on Sunday. So looking forward to that. But this is the conclusion of the webinar series. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks again to our speakers, and hopefully see everyone again soon for another webinar series. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.